This is my first ever pro analysis video, and what I want to do with this series is look more at the tactical side of table tennis. And each episode I'm going to take a professional match and break down what's going on with the tactics and the strategies of each player and how one player actually manages to come out on top. And for the first episode, I've picked the men's final at the US Open, which happened about 5 days ago, and that was between Wang Jinxin and Adrian Crisan. And this is a really interesting game because after the first set, the commentators were pretty much saying that Wang didn't have a hope.
Wang's got his work cut out. I'm not sure he can compete in this match.
Then he actually wins the game 4-2. So whenever that happens, you know that there's been some kind of tactical or strategic change that is worth looking into. So I thought that'd be a great one to start off on. What we see in the first set is pretty much a tutorial on how not to play Crisan. So we have Wang getting stuck in a load of backhand to backhand rallies, which is Crisan's strength.
Through. Just such strong.
And doing loads of short touch play close to the net, short serves, and letting Crisan use his backhand flick fade that he likes to do so much.
Oh, you don't want to drop that high.
He clearly hadn't really thought out his tactics beforehand or worked out how best to play Crisan, because he was just doing exactly what Crisan wanted to do. And you could tell he was a bit nervous as well, and he was making unforced errors that you wouldn't expect from a player of his level. The second game actually went to Wang, but I think largely that was Crisan taking his foot off the gas. You could see that after winning the first set 11-4, he was just a little bit sloppy, like his service returns weren't so great, his movement was poor.
All weekend, his serve return has been somewhat poor. Like right there.
I think he'd kind of maybe assumed he was going to coast it and had underestimated Wang. Then he came back in the third set, dominated again, loads of backhand to backhand rallies, Wang hardly able to get his forehand in at all, and yeah, 2-1 to Crisan. And it kind of looked like, apart from that kind of slip up in the second, that Crisan was gonna walk it 4-1. So what does Wang do? How is he going to deal with this situation? He's kind of got himself a bit stuck just being dominated by Adrian and playing his game, and he needs to find a way out of it. And fortunately he did so.
Oh, Jinxin Wang!
And he had a few really good tactics that he put into use to help him to get a foot back into the game. The first was just to play less backhand to backhand. Like, if you're more of a forehand player and you're playing a backhand player, you don't want to get stuck in these backhand to backhand rallies. He was struggling to find ways out of it, but he started serving more to the forehand, which gave him an opportunity.
At times good, but other times very weak. There's the forehand.
Right.
He also started using his backhand block a bit more effectively, so instead of just getting pinned, constantly going cross court, he was actually managing to switch a few down the line, or even just managing to get that backhand block into Crisan's kind of right armpit on his crossover point. That just makes it a bit more difficult for him to play than constantly feeding him balls into the backhand. So that was one thing that he did really well. Another thing that Wang did that made a big difference was he started serving long. So he was actually throwing in more fast serves, which, you know, can be suicide at a top 100 level in the world when players are just going to rip those past you. But against Crisan, it was actually working out.
Romanian.
Deep serve under the backhand.
He wasn't attacking that hard. Wang was able to counter-attack, and it meant that he didn't have to deal with all the fiddly in and out touch short play stuff where Crisan can use his wrist and his feeling and make things difficult for him. Another great tactic that he put to use was actually kind of digging some of these serves long, actually giving Crisan opportunities to attack a push, like a long push. On some occasions, Crisan was actually doing side top serves and Wang was coming down and kind of hacking them down. Just basically saying to Crisan, I'm going to give you this long ball, but you've got to actually do the first attack yourself.
His offense is just not strong enough. See? It's not strong enough.
So if you are playing against a kind of counter-attacking player, that can actually be a pretty good tactic. You do things like serving long, giving them long pushes, giving them opportunities to attack and making them attack first. Because if they're not that kind of typical two-wing looper power player that you often come up against, they're probably going to struggle like that. And I know that actually I don't particularly like receiving long serves off people. I'm not the best at attacking those. And I don't really like doing open-ups that much either if people are really digging the ball at me. I'd rather stay close to the table, let them do the work, kind of use my wrist, move it around, do things like that. So I can kind of relate to the way that Crisan plays. So yeah, some really great tactics from Wang there. Sometimes you saw that he's still getting stuck doing backhand and those things and letting Crisan do his big backhand fades down the line and move him around, but generally that was paying off. And then the final thing you saw was just his ability to start power blocking a bit more, like getting a hard block on things instead of a soft block.
Oh, those are some strong blocks there by Wang.
And what that did was that just pushed Crisan back from the table a step or two. And then once he was back, we were much more in kind of Wang's game. So when Crisan was close to the table, he was able to dominate, he was able to get all the angles and make Wang having to move side to side. And Crisan is so good at going kind of wide into the backhand, then next one wide to the forehand and really getting those balls curving off. But once Wang got him back from the table, we saw that his movement was letting him down a bit. Like, he's not the most athletic of players. He was getting himself off balance. Sometimes you could actually see his whole body kind of turn one way and run that way, run back the other way. He was playing backhands kind of like that. And Wang, on the other hand, was brilliant at staying low, staying balanced, kind of quick footwork movements to cover the whole table, kind of like what the Chinese players are famed for, being quick and powerful and able to get really good footwork so that they can get themselves into position, whereas Crisan was actually often kind of in the way, having to take the ball late, and that was a big difference, and we really saw that paying off in the last few games. So those are just some things to think about. If you want to get better at tactics, then just thinking about these ideas, watching what the top players are doing and trying to implement some of their own strategies is a great way to go. I think the takeaway from this match for anyone that's watching is that even if your typical game is to do things like, you know, keeping the ball short, serving short, touching short, attacking into your opponent's backhand, because usually that's weaker, you will come up against players that are just a bit unorthodox, or their strengths are not the typical strengths, such as Adrian Crisan, and you need to be able to change your game, and Wang was able to do that really well. As the game progressed, he kind of was making these little changes that put the kind of the ball in his court instead of, whereas at the start of the game it was all just Crisan doing whatever he wanted to. So you've got to find ways to adapt, and it can be tricky because in many ways you got to overwrite your natural instincts, which are, you know, not to just give people long pushes that they can attack, not to do too many serves long, because normally you'd get punished for those things, but against some players it pays off. And I guess that's the takeaway from this, is that you need to pay close attention to who you're playing, because if Wang had just kept doing what he always does, he probably would have lost that game really early on. But it was his ability to adapt and make those kind of changes, serving to the forehand, serving long, digging the ball, actually just changing things up a bit more, playing into the armpit of Crisan that gave him the advantage, which then he converted into the win. So really interesting game. If you haven't watched it, I'll put the link below this video so you can go and check that out, and I'll have a new video for you in about a week's time.